Here we go. So welcome everyone to today, the 16th of the month. We passed the halfway marker of our month-long Let's Talk About series, where we, meaning NAMI Juno and the Juno Suicide Prevention Coalition, are honoring Suicide Prevention Awareness Month by talking about different topics related to promoting mental health, reducing stigma associated with talking about suicide and mental illness, and encouraging good mental well-being and help-seeking behavior. Today, I am very pleased to introduce our presenter, Mel Batchelor, who has been on 2 other times, I think, already. Is this number 3 for you?
Yep.
Cool. 3rd time presenting in 3 weeks, and she'll be talking about peer support. If you would like closed captions for this presentation, there's a button at the bottom of the screen that says closed caption. You can see that in Zoom. If you're on Facebook, I'll post the Zoom link in a moment, so you can switch over if you would prefer closed captions. And with that, let's take it away, Mel. Tell us what you got.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm happy to be here again presenting. These have been really interesting and beneficial, so I'm glad to be talking about peer support today because I think it's another topic that is really very connected to not only mental health, but suicide prevention as well. So I put together a little bit of a slideshow, just kind of talking about really general, broad concepts around peer support. So a lot of you might be familiar with the term peer support already, but in case you're not, this is kind of a general description. So a basic definition would be a process through which people who share common experiences or face similar challenges come together as equals to give and receive help based on knowledge that comes through shared experience. So peer support isn't always related to mental health. But in this case, we're talking about peer support in relation to mental health. So the main values of peer support in mental health are agency, shared learning, and centering those with lived experience. And when I say lived experience, I'm referring to people who have mental illness or who have experienced mental distress. So some examples of peer support that you're probably familiar with in some regard are support groups. That's a huge example of a peer-led type of support that fosters agency and shared learning and centering lived experience. There are also other types of peer support like peer-led crisis services, which is a very new and up-and-coming idea, and peer-led community programs, really anything that is led by folks who have lived experience and is centering those values. So Darby Penny kind of discussed how peer support can kind of fall into 2 different categories. So there's peer-developed peer support, which is sort of like the original approach to peer support, where it's not hierarchical and centers people with lived experience. It was influenced by the civil rights movement and independent living movements in like the 60s and 70s. And now we have kind of like a newer type of peer support that emerged in, I believe, the 90s, where you have people who can become certified peer support specialists and work alongside mental health professionals. So that has some, pros and cons to it too, because it's still in that like traditional setting, but it does show that we are incorporating the values of peer support more into like traditional settings, which can make them more accessible to people who maybe had some apprehensions about seeking traditional types of mental health care. So peer support kind of discusses a new way of conceptualizing mental illness that is a little bit different from the traditional ways that in the US mental illness has been thought of. It it inherently critiques the medical model, which, without going too much into that, is basically just the idea that mental illness is a biological thing that should be cured. And there's a lot of different perspectives on mental health that critique the medical model, because the medical model doesn't focus on social factors like trauma or politics or environment. And there has been a push, like with recovery programs and recovery language, to have the focus for mental health care be more on a recovery format rather than a need for a cure, so to speak. So because of this, you know, there's lots of different views on even language around mental illness, even the term mental illness itself. So peer support is prioritizing people who have had these critiques of these more traditional concepts. So one way that I think about peer support is kind of thinking about it in conjunction with other disability movements or perspectives. So lots of like broader disability advocates will reframe disability as like a difference rather than a deviance from the norm. So it's something that's not like bad or wrong or needs to be like completely like gotten rid of in order for you to live a fulfilling life. And that's essentially what these peer support type of programs do. They value agency and shared learning. So they're not saying that, you know, not mentally ill people are better than mentally ill people. They're not saying that like not mentally ill people can't learn from mentally ill people. There's no one understands the needs of someone with mental illness better than people with mental illness, because they have that lived experience. So some ways that we support peer support is, you know, this sounds really basic, but just to respect people's differences. Like I said, peer support is really rooted in the idea of like shared learning and agency, and not having like not mentally ill people prioritized or like put on a pedestal. So, you know, being like mindful of language and being aware that like, you know, we have a long way to go. And, you know, various people have different, you know, ideas of what they want and what they need. So not everybody wants to be cured of something, you know, not everybody has like a very, you know, rigid recovery plan. So being mindful of that when we are talking about mental health. And, you know, learning about mental illness from people with mental illness, that really is like the cornerstone of peer support. And that applies to people who like, who don't necessarily have a mental illness as well, but maybe want to incorporate these, you know, these values of peer support into their own like mental health advocacy or understanding of mental health. Some good ways to do that are to like invite people with lived experience to like your events, or to like talk to, like, maybe if you have like a group, to like speak to them. And then also like reading narratives from people with lived experience. The Collected Schizophrenias is great. It's a collection of essays, and she has one called Yale Will Not Save You that just really connected with me. And then uplifting local like peer support programs and support groups, you know, so giving resources to peer support groups so that people have access to groups and can find people who have a common lived experience and can share that connection with them, that they might it might be really hard to find because we are still very, you know, mental health is still very stigmatized, and we do still have this unfair assumption that, you know, people with lived experience can't help each other, and that's exactly what peer support is trying to dismantle. So that's about all I have. And I think that Erin wanted to talk a little bit about how the programs that we have in Juneau that prioritize like the shared learning between people with lived experience.
That'd be great, but first, can I ask you a couple questions? And you're muted, but
Absolutely.
there we go. Thank you. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about the language that is associated with peer support. I think that language is like, I don't know, there's a quote, I can't remember exactly what it is, but like learning new vocabulary opens yourself to new thoughts and ideas. And so I think like having like the specific language can really can like round out the concepts of something new, something that might be a new thought for people like peer support. Is there specific language, you mentioned it a second ago, you brushed on it. Is there specific language that you think is relevant for us to know?
Well, I think there are terms like lived experience that people use a lot. And these things, you know, peer lived experience can have different meanings in different contexts, but generally speaking, lived experience refers to people with mental illness. And then there is also, you know, the controversy around the term mental illness that a lot of people have different opinions on. You know, some people like to use less medical language. So they might say like mental distress. So I think that in regards to language, you know, opening yourself up for the possibility that someone might not use the terminology that you're familiar with, and how like that's a really broad spectrum, but you know, people have different opinions on, and also like a lot of people with mental illness, they might say like disability, or they might say mental health condition. So those are just some like identity terms. And then I think that like the really specific differences between like types of peer support is a little like nuanced, and you don't have to go that deep, but you know, just prioritizing like respect and what that person is comfortable with, I think is a good baseline.
Very helpful, thank you. And you mentioned just now that like the term mental illness is difficult. I think it's for some, it speaks to a medical model that has let people down historically in the past. Can you say a little bit more about that? Like the difficulty with looking at mental illness or mental distress or emotional unwellness, like all the different terms that we can choose to use. And like the limitations of thinking about those experiences in a solely medical way. Was that a clear question? I hope so.
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, I mein that is like a whole like book. Well, that's several books in itself, but like I you know, there's a lot of issues with just focusing on the medical model, a big one being that you're not prioritizing reasons like trauma, social reasons, environmental factors that lead to mental distress. It makes it more of like an individual's issue. So it's like, oh, if you're not getting better, that's your problem. When it's like, it's really hard for like, there's a quote somewhere, it's like, you can't heal in the environment that made you sick. So, you know, like there's a lot of like really intense political trauma happening right now, you know, like there's a lot of really like violent images that we're just like constantly bombarded with. So that's obviously going to take a toll on people's mental well-being. But, you know, a medical model perspective wouldn't consider things like that. And then also just historically, because people with mental illness, mental distress, however they identify, have been treated like they are they need to be cured, like something's deviant or wrong with them, it has led to you know, institutionalization, to, you know, this really pretty dark history of types of mental health treatment in the US in the past. So that's definitely something to be aware of when we talk about peer support, because it really did initially stem from a response to sort of the trauma of that history. And and while, you know, incorporating peer support into like traditional models of mental health, or not mental health, but mental health care, is like a new thing. I think if they are centering those sort of like critiques and learning from people with lived experience, I think it could be really beneficial to have that like type of collaboration, to make sure that we are not perpetuating problems like that.
It's really well said, and I agree that it can, you know, this topic can take up novels. But I think if I can oversimplify it, and I love oversimplifying things, I would say like the problem is two halves. I think one is the focus on there is a problem, we need to fix it, ignoring the entirety of the human experience, exactly as you said, that there's situational things. Like that's like half of the issue. The other half is that there is still stigma with mental illness. And so if I have a broken arm, no one's like, ooh, Aaron, that is a problem, get it fixed. Like we're talking about like, how do we set up my kitchen so I don't need to use that arm? Like we are talking about it in a very recovery oriented mindset. That's the same with most physical ailments. But with mental illness, because there's stigma, and that's something that's existed in society forever, it really just points to problem, problem, problem. There needs to be a solution now, exactly as you said. And so I think it's the two things. It's the stigma that's latched onto it that makes the care that you receive problem focused, and the fact that it ignores the world that we live in. So I just want to like summarize that, because I think that you said it very well, and I appreciate your words.
Thank you. And I definitely, you know, I agree that that's one of the reasons why looking at this in connection with, you know, what like disability activists are doing is really, I think, insightful, because there is that like key of like accessibility. Like it's a lot more helpful to like tell someone, oh, I'll help you with this, or like let's make this more accessible, or let's change a system that is like trying to cut you out, versus telling them like, oh, that's like your problem, you need to solve that yourself, like you need to change, you know. So I think that that definitely goes hand in hand with like this, you know, conversation around stigma, and why that is far from being eradicated, unfortunately. Yeah.
I also feel obligated, now that we're talking about it, like say like there is a place for the medical field in helping people. Like at various times in my life, I've benefited from medication. I've benefited from traditional mental health treatment, which is problem focused. What is your specific symptom that we are going to talk about to solve? Like there's a place for all that. And so in my view, recovery is a big thing. It's a big, broad road. You can drive in a lot of different lanes, sometimes multiple lanes at the same time. And peer support is absolutely a part of it. For me personally, Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous were the two things that got me engaged with recovery on any level. Those are the two most well-known, probably peer-led support groups that exist. And that was what jump-started my path on recovery. And so it's all parts of the whole, trying to get people better. So I think I'm glad you're bringing this up. And I'm glad that you're giving us some kind of like context and framework to think about peer support.
Thank you, and well said.
So you wanted to turn over to me now to talk about some other programs. I'm happy to do that.
Yes, that would be great.
So NAMI Juno and every NAMI affiliate that exists started as peer support. And it started as family members of people with mental illness getting together to talk about their experience and what was helpful as they tried to get their family member help and what wasn't helpful. And that still carries through to today. And I think that there's a couple different ways to divide up NAMI's programming. I think one half, you can think of it as one half as family members and loved ones of people in mental distress or people with mental illness. And the other half is the people who are experiencing some kind of unwellness themselves. Like another way to split up the work of NAMI affiliates is support groups, which are ongoing conversations, and education programs, which are defined amount of time to just download education and information into your brain. So NAMI Juno, we have 2 support groups. One is for family members and friends of individuals with mental illness or otherwise in recovery. Those meet every other week. We have it on our website, namijuno.org. We also have an online support group for people with mental illness. And that's called our Connections group. And that's also every other week. Right now it's online. And you can see our schedule at namijuno.org. We also have education classes. So we have one class, it's called the Family and Friends Seminar. It's a one-time thing, 2 hours on October 1st from 5:30 to 7:30. And it's a general overview. I think it's great for people who maybe like there's a new diagnosis in their family and they are confused and don't know where to begin. It'll give you like a very quick overview of what it means now that there's somebody in your life who is having some kind of mental health issue that you want to support them in. The other class that we have coming up, October 13th, it's an 8-week class. It'll be in the evenings, I think 5:30 to 7:30, maybe 6 to 8. It's called Family to Family. And that's peer-led. It's family members of, it's volunteers who are family members of people with mental illness, teaching other family members of people with mental illness in a much more elaborate, in-depth fashion about what supports are available and what is going on with their loved one. And it's 8 weeks long, like I said, and gets into a lot more depth than the one-time seminar. So both are helpful depending on how much information you want and where you're at in terms of your knowledge and familiarity. So I want to make sure you all know that these programs exist. And these are just like one of many examples of peer support programs. Again, like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, all the different anonymous groups, I think are the most publicly visible peer support services that exist. There's peer support at most community mental health providers in the country at this point. There's been a huge push over the last 10 years to make that a standard part of treatment when you are getting outpatient or inpatient behavioral health care from federally funded behavioral health providers. And there's a lot of other, like message boards and newsletters and other online groups that meet. And you can find paid versions, you can find free versions. It's really all over the map. You can find Facebook groups dedicated to specific diagnoses or symptoms. You can find subreddits around, different populations. It can be a support group for a specific diagnosis, specific illness, or it can be around your personal identity outside of what you're trying to be, what you're in recovery from. Veterans is another thing. And so actually, this is a nice time to plug the fact that we are convening a new group of people to provide suicide prevention messaging. So it's veterans creating and providing suicide prevention messaging to people in Juneau. And that's going to be meeting next Thursday, September 24th. Please email me or us or send us a message if you're interested. But the idea is like some of that messaging is to connect to those individuals, to other people who have experienced something similar. So we might have like a bus ad, but we also want to provide specific peer support. And the veteran community is another community that does have a lot of different peer support. And the common thread in those groups is your veteran status as much as it is your specific mental illness. So I don't know, that's my spiel. We had a comment come in that our coworker Tina is passing along to us. Somebody who says that unfortunately they don't want to claim mental illness because of the stigma, and sometimes that prevents them from getting help. They appreciate the wording of mental distressing conditions, but dislike feeling like they don't want to get help. And I think I'd like to leave us off with talking about this a little bit. And I think there's a couple different pieces of this. I think there's the stigma that gets in the way of asking for help. And that's why I think talking about these topics in any way that we can talk about it can help increase help-seeking behavior. And letting people know that there's different ways of getting help, so that maybe it feels uncomfortable to talk to your doctor or a teacher or like somebody, some like institution in your life, but maybe you can just find a peer-led group on your own that is less intimidating to enter. So Mel, what are your thoughts about reducing stigma and or finding those different resources, or any other thoughts that you have? Floor is
yeah, I think that peer support, for me personally, was the most important thing for reducing stigma, and reducing my own internalized, stigma. Once I started connecting with people who had similar experiences to me, it really changed my perspective, because before that point, I had only heard about, my symptoms through doctors. And when you are cut off from that, broader community of people, it feels like it's like, this is like my problem and I feel bad about this and I don't want to like tell anybody. And then you start, connecting with people, and it starts really becoming like community care in a sense. Like you're really all like helping each other and supporting each other, and can relate on a level that, maybe those doctors are not able to relate on. So while, that can be a very important facet for a lot of people's, recovery and mental health treatment, I think peer support can be a really important facet outside of those traditional forms of mental health care for just becoming more comfortable with yourself. And I'll also highlight something you said earlier. Social media is a really great, accessible way to find peer support. It gets, social media gets a really bad reputation, but there are really like a lot of people out there who are, sharing their stories, Instagram or like Twitter or Facebook, who are, all kind of like showing this support and sharing, resources and stories. And, it does help to just know that like there are people out there, and not only are there people out there like you, but they're not ashamed of themselves, and they're working towards, they're working towards becoming more comfortable with their own individual like needs moving forward. So I do think that hopefully I relate to what you're saying, and hopefully maybe like a peer support type deal, or whatever helps you move forward in feeling more comfortable with your own experience, because I've definitely been there as well.
We had another comment on Facebook from Verity Blankenship. Thank you, Verity. Asking for a book list or some kind of recommended reading. And I think what we can do is put together a post in the next couple of days of some recommended reading, and also some places where you can find like reputable peer support groups. We would never be able to make an exhaustive list, but like for Juno specifically, there's a website that is up to date about AA and NA. We'll look into some online forums for information and discussion, which are again different forms of peer support. The information is different than a support group, but it's all parts of the whole. And Verity also mentioned incorporating peer support in outpatient and inpatient care, and how it's difficult because it's not billable. And let me just tell you, Verity, that it is billable in I think something like 30 states right now by care providers, and that number has grown, and it might actually be more than that by now. And it'll soon be billable at a couple different places in Alaska. It's still not billable statewide as far as I'm concerned, but with some regulatory changes, that might be outdated information as well. So like these peer support services are being incorporated into behavioral health institutions. They are becoming billable, which ultimately makes them sustainable. You're not asking for volunteers. You're not looking for grants to keep it going. But it also then means that it makes peer support part of the system, which changes the I don't want to say like the openness of it and the fact that it can look a lot of different ways and be really person-centered. It changes that perspective also. So like anything else, there's good and bad, and it's yet another piece of the whole that is somebody's individual recovery. So I think those are my final thoughts. I don't see any other comments or questions. Mel, any last words of wisdom for us?
That's all I have, but thanks everyone for listening, and I definitely have a few books to put on that list, so that sounds like something that we can definitely come up with.
Fantastic, thank you. Rest of this month, we'll keep going every day at noon. Weekday at noon. Tomorrow we have two folks from Coast Guard, one active duty, one veteran, talking about their recovery from mental illness. Friday we have SAIL talking about traumatic and acquired brain injuries. And in the next couple weeks, we'll have some different presentations about NAMI programs. We'll get into a little bit more detail. Talk about youth mental health support. We'll talk about art therapy. And a couple other things that are not on top of my mind right now, but we post all the listings, so you all will know about it. So thanks everyone. Appreciate your time, Mel, in particular. Number 3, great job. And we'll talk to you all soon. Goodbye.
Goodbye.